they did, but it was a fairly heavy financial burden. They didn't necessarily want to do it. They spent an awful lot of time in the 20s and 30s trying to come to an understanding, even if somewhat unwritten, with France to prevent them having to build up a large fleet to counter the French, who they saw as their traditional potential foe or rival. And so when France started building up its navy largely in response to the German build-up, and the Italians then felt they had to build up in response to the French then felt they had to build up in response to the Germans and the Italians, which then led to this upward spiral in the 1930s of naval construction programs. Italy did build a fleet that was a little bit beyond its capability to fuel, and as I said, it did involve a fair bit of expense, but if they were prepared to make the necessary sacrifices within their economy, their plan was realistic. France pretty much was in a similar boat, with the exception that France had more economic power to throw at the problem. So their naval plan in terms of ships was fairly comfortable. However, because of what they were trying to do in terms of the larger ships, the battleships and the aircraft carriers, and the limitations on the pre-existing infrastructure, in order to compete and keep up with everyone, they were going to have to invest a huge amount in expanding their naval infrastructure and dockyard space, and that it made their building program considerably more expensive than a similar one for some other navies. So, for example, when the French wanted to build originally for the four Richelieus and then the Alsace follow-ons, in order to do that, they would have had to invest massive amounts of money in upgrading the slipways, for example. Whereas for the British, although there were some dockyard considerations, they didn't have to invest any particularly large amount of money in expanding dockyards to build the King George V or to build the Lions or whatever, because they already had it. So, somewhat like with Italy, France could do what they wanted to do, but it was going to cost them a lot more than they'd ideally want it to, in terms of francs invested versus ships received, or lira if you're Italian. Then you get on to the Russians. The Russians, thanks to the revolution and the period thereafter, really were on a bit of a steep learning curve. They had, well, Stalin had plans for these grandiose fleets. In theory, Russian economic and industrial output could provide that, but they were in an even worse position infrastructure and wise than the French, and qualitatively their warship building industry had stagnated massively since the First World War. So they could, in theory, build some of what Stalin wanted. They definitely couldn't build the kind of massive doom fleets that Stalin originally wanted, but the slightly more practical scaled down version, where you're building, 4 Sovietsky Soyuz instead of 30 or something like that, they could build them. Supporting even that downscaled fleet, however, probably would have been a somewhat fraught issue, at least for a good long while, because they face a problem that's even more exacerbated than the French, in that whilst the French have to upgrade some of their existing infrastructure, the Russians have to build large amounts of that infrastructure pretty much from scratch. There are advantages to that, but cost is not one of them. Then you get on to the two worst offenders. Japan, historically, World War I and the run-up to the Washington Treaty was throwing huge amounts of money at its defense programs, and whilst that died off a little bit in the interwar period, the programs they had in the mid to late 1930s really were, again, pushing the envelope of what was possible for them. It's one of the reasons, to be fair, they acknowledge this is why they built the Yamatos instead of trying to build larger numbers of treaty battleships. But their naval construction programs were getting considerably more ambitious. The Circle 4, Circle 5, Circle 6 programs especially the latter two,